church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and I'm delighted that you are listening to our podcast today. There are so many things going on in the world, big things in the world. I mean, here in the United States, the House of Representatives, the leadership of the House of Representatives seems to be in total disarray at a time where we have major issues on our southern border. We have the Ukraine war underway that we obviously are involved in terms of international relations. And we have all kinds of domestic problems that have to do with financial problems and financial institutions. And on top of that, now we have this war on Israel. This war on Israel. Last week, because of the war on Israel, I seized the opportunity to talk about who created Israel and what the Apostle Paul had to say about the responsibility of Gentile believers toward Jews. After my wife heard this podcast, she said to me, it posed a question. She said, why do people hate the Jews so much? Well, if we go to the dictionary and look up the word hate, it will tell us that hate is an intense negative emotion towards certain people or things or objects or ideas. And, it's usually related to opposition to them or revulsion, pure revulsion toward these things. Hatred, for many people, is seen as the opposite of love. That's probably a good way to describe it. Dr. Mary Fagan explains that we view hate differently throughout our lifetimes. And when we first learn of hate as youngsters, as little ones, it's a foreign, formidable, forbidden thing. It almost becomes like a curse word. Hate. And then during our hormone-fueled adolescence, hate suddenly becomes more accessible, sounding like a pesky jingle dedicated to just about anything from Brussels sprouts to math teachers. In my case, it was the Latin teacher. I had a problem with because I was not good, and I'm sure I probably said from time to time that I hate that teacher, I hate that class. And so things change, and as the seasons go by in our adulthood, most people want to distance themselves from hate because, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's just too great a burden to bear. Hate at its most fundamental level involves an appraisal that a person or a group is evil. Now, some of the unique features of hate is the motivation to eliminate the object of your hate. Revenge is often part of hate, because the idea behind revenge is to want to hurt the person or the group that has hurt you and hurt them as much. Now, we use the word hate very casually in everyday life. It's like we were saying, I hate the teacher because she gave me a bad grade. Now, research has taught us a lot about hate. Hate spreads and increases quicker if it's directed at a group as opposed to an individual. That's because when you hate a group, the intensity of your hate can grow without you being confronted with specific persons or contrasting information from the group. So it's a lot easier to hate a group. And you have the opportunity to base your hate on the stereotypes and prejudices about that group. Now, if you hate an individual, your hate may be countered with empathy or a reappraisal of that person when you encounter their positive side. So, what's the difference between hate, anger, and contempt? You hate someone because of what they are. You get angry at someone because of what they did. Now, anger can be considered more in terms of behavior, how you behave. When people get angry at someone, they often have the feeling that they can control that other person. I'm angry at you, so I can control you. And so anger, is essentially trying to remove the obstacle that is posed by that other person. They're preventing you from reaching a goal somehow. For instance, if you get angry and you want an apology, you're really wanting somebody to change their behavior. And when you're experiencing anger and nothing changes, that's when contempt arises. Contempt is feeling like the other person's not even worth your anger. We get into a situation where we're still angry and we're trying to regulate our anger, and we get to the point where we start looking down on that other person. We get to the point where we don't even feel that other person is worth our attention. That's why the object of being, that's why if you're the object of someone's contempt, it's worse than being the object of their hate. With hate, you can't be indifferent towards that person. You're engaged because you want to get rid of them. When you want to get rid of them socially, mentally, maybe physically, you want to get rid of them. Studies have demonstrated that hate can spread from one generation to another much easier than anger. For instance, if you ask people who experienced war, and then others who had only heard about that war from other people's stories, the amount of hate that's reported will be the same. So, in other words, this means that not only can people hate others based on someone else's experiences, but that hatred can be just as intense if they had experienced it themselves. So think of this in the context of the Palestinians who've been at war with the Jews for generations. Now, we seem to be just awash in a sea of hatred in contemporary society. We're constantly witnessing traumatizing instances of hatred on our televisions, trucks plowing down pedestrians on sidewalks and in department stores, in Christmas markets, and innocent children getting shot by other kids in hallways and classrooms, and what we've come to call drive-by shootings. Bombs going off in subways and pop concerts and in airports, even outside residences. Hate's not a single unified emotion. No, it's a composite of many other emotions. Moral disgust, rage, resentment, fear. But these components add up to what may ultimately feel like and become a single integrated feeling that's overwhelming and exceedingly intense. Today, most states and the federal government have hate crimes that are aimed at the prosecution of individuals who are committing crimes against victims on the basis of perceived or actual race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. These crimes are often very violent and include such things as assault and murder and arson, vandalism, or threats to commit these crimes. These hate crimes, they affect families and communities and even at times the entire nation. Experts estimate that, unbelievably, an average of 250,000 hate crimes are committed each year in the United States. And the majority of them are not reported to law enforcement. There are people who've been attacked in a hate crime, and it never even gets reported to law enforcement. Among hate crimes reported to law enforcement, you're probably not going to be surprised that Jews far outnumber any other religious group that have been attacked in a hate crime. You hear the word anti-Semitism, which refers to prejudice and or discrimination against Jews as individuals or as a group. Anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes and myths that targets Jews as a people, their religious practices and beliefs, and the Jewish state of Israel, as is being played out before our eyes right now. Are you shocked at the amount of pro-Palestinian / Hamas demonstrations that are occurring here in the United States? This is a terrorist group, and we had our entire capital this week taken over by demonstrators supporting this group. As we heap criticism on this Palestinians' current war in Israel, and I might say justifiably, we also have to face the fact that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is alive and well in the United States. This is not a new phenomenon. One of the low points in U.S. history is the murder of a young woman by the name of Mary Fagan and the lynching of Leo Frank. Mary Fagan was on her way to Atlanta's Confederate Memorial Day Parade on April 26, 1913, when she stopped at the National Pencil Company where she worked to collect her paycheck, $1.20 for her 10 cents an hour work. The next day, the girl's body was discovered in the factory's basement. The last person to see her alive was Frank Leo, a Jewish man raised in Brooklyn, New York, who had graduated with an engineering degree from Cornell University in 1906. Leo Frank was arrested for the murder, and during the trial, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, chanting, "Hang the Jew! Hang the Jew! Hang the Jew!" The noise outside the courtroom was so loud that it was difficult for the judge to even hear the answers from the jurors, although they were only 10 feet away from him. The trial was based on circumstantial evidence that made national headlines. The four-week trial ended with a guilty verdict on August 25th of that year, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. And almost all historians agree that he was wrongfully accused. The governor of Georgia on June 22nd, 1915, commuted his death sentence to life in prison. Well, several thousand people with guns and hatchets and dynamite surrounded the governor's mansion to oppose his decision. And they were eventually dispersed by the state militiamen at that time. On August 17th of that year, a mob of 25 men calling themselves Knights of Mary Fagan overpowered the guards at the prison farm where he was being held and kidnapped him from his cell and drove him 100 miles away to Oak Grove near Marietta, Georgia, Fagan's hometown, where he was handcuffed and hung, lynched. And as the word spread that Leo Frank's body was twisting from a limb on the outskirts of Marietta, a crowd of over 3,000 people gathered. They pulled and pecked and tore Frank's corpse, tearing away his nightshirt, while a photographer snapped pictures. The mob included some of Marietta's most prominent citizens. Preachers, former governor, former mayor, doctors, a judge, son of a U.S. senator, and lawyers were all among them. A terrible episode in American history, the lynching of an innocent Jewish man. Now, those in the aftermath of this terror, about half of the 3,000 Jews who lived in Georgia at that time left the state. Those who remained hid behind locked doors, forced to survive a widespread boycott of any Jewish business. Leo Frank was finally pardoned in 1986. This incident, in my opinion, was sort of a launching pad for anti-Semitism in modern America. So I'll return to my initial question. Why do people hate the Jews so much? 7 decades after the Holocaust, the hatreds of Jews and Judaism has reappeared with a vengeance in the major capitals of Europe and to a lesser degree here in the United States. Jews as a people and Israel as their land seem once again to be the scapegoats that are being held responsible for all the world's ills and the cause of all its wrongs. The Old Testament prophet Abraham, the father of Judaism and Christianity, took his family to Canaan, where the Jews became a people nation. 1,000 years before Christ, a new nation came into being. And, it's during those centuries before Christ, the Hebrews, the early Jewish people, experienced intermittent persecution over and over again because they refused to adopt the religion of the locale that they were in, or the religion of local rulers. And this refusal was seen by these other nations as stubborn, and they resented it. In my opinion, this is the beginning of anti-Judaism with the Old Testament nation of Israel. Some feel that anti-Semitism, just the hatred of Jews just because they're Jews, began on Mount Sinai when the 10 Commandments were given to the Jewish people. Now, interestingly, Sinai in Hebrew is similar to their word Sanah, and Sanah means hatred. It was here that the Jews accepted the higher law of morality and ethics. It really was this that's responsible for the world's hatred toward Jews. You see, it was the Jews who first preached the message of the Ten Commandments that's behind much of modern day law and is inscribed on many monuments and many buildings all through America. They preached that the message of the Ten Commandments includes the respect for fellow mankind. As the mother of religion for both Christianity and Islam, Judaism pioneered the act of living in accordance with divine law. Anti-Semitism, the process of detesting the Jews, occurs because it acknowledges that the Jews are the conscience of humanity and the lawgivers of ethical and moral behavior. Amazingly enough, Adolf Hitler dared to verbalize this as his justification for the plan of genocide for the Jewish people when Adolf Hitler said, conscience is a Jewish invention like circumcision. My task is to free men from the dirty and degrading ideas of conscience and morality. You see, this is part of why the Jews are hated. The world is focused right now on this war on Israel by the Palestinians backed by Iran. And both have said that they seek the extermination of Israel and Jews. I have to say, this kind of anti-Semitism is not limited to Muslim groups. In the Western world, holding Jews, of course wrongly, responsible for the death of Jesus Christ by Christians has gone on for centuries. Logically, it should have been asked, wasn't Jesus himself a Jew? Christianity emerged from Judaism. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the rituals of Judaism. Why on earth would Jews kill one of their own? The subtle truth is that some Jews, especially the political sect known as the Pharisees, they just considered Jesus to be bad news. And he mocked them as power-hungry hypocrites. And they gladly handed this troublemaker over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who obliged them by condemning him to crucifixion. So the exact truth is that Rome, the Romans, the Roman government killed Jesus while certain Jews looked the other way. But in the following centuries, since that time, some of the Gospels have been misinterpreted to continue blaming the Jews forever for killing Jesus. In the first century, the Romans destroyed the Jewish state, and most Jews were scattered throughout the ancient world as the Roman Empire was Christianized. The Roman rulers considered Judaism a threat to their newfound Christianity. And then hundreds of years later, during the Middle Ages, laws were passed to discriminate against Jews. Jews were forbidden to marry Christians and prohibited from holding positions in government or appearing as witnesses against Christians. And then it was during this time that certain bizarre ideas arose that foreshadowed the anti-Semitism of the 20th century. It was alleged that Jews had horns and tails and engaged in ritual murder of Christians. middle of the 14th century, the bubonic plague spread throughout Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. And fear and superstition and ignorance prompted the need to find someone to blame. The Jews were a convenient scapegoat. And because of the myths and the stereotypes that were already believed about them, they were accused of things like poisoning wells and intentionally spreading the disease. And history tells us that there were over 100,000 Jews who were burned alive for this and other false accusations, including using the blood of Christian boys for Passover traditions. Martin Luther, the founder of the 16th century Reformation, the father of Protestantism, he wrote a pamphlet in 1545 that was entitled "The Jews and Their Lies." And he urged the slaying of Jews because he bought into the myths about Jewish thirst for Christian blood. And guess what? The Nazis reprinted this pamphlet in 1935 as part of their propaganda. You know, in the 13th century, the Jews were increasingly subjected to political and economic and social discrimination that resulted in the deprivation of their legal and civil rights. They were forced to live in ghettos, and in many areas, they were forced to wear distinctive symbols and badges and even pointed hats so they could be immediately recognized. An action that was revisited by the Nazis in the 20th century. You know, since Jews were not allowed to own land and the church did not allow Christians to loan money for profit, Jews had few alternatives but to become money lenders. And guess what? A whole new set of stereotypes began to evolve, accusing Jews of being money hungry and greedy money lenders. You know, by the 1800s, Jews were being accused of conspiring to run Germany, and in Russia, Jewish rabbis were accused of having a secret plot to take over the world. It made it easy for Adolf Hitler to evoke fear among the German people and spread his position that the Jews would contaminate what he considered to be the superior Aryan race, the Jews. Now, therefore, according to Adolf Hitler's doctrine, all Jews in the genetic pool had to be eliminated, and that led to the Holocaust, where millions of Jews were exterminated. It wasn't until the 1960s that the churches around the world, including the Catholic Church, rejected the historic and dangerous charge that the Jewish people were responsible for the death of Jesus. But this didn't end anti-Semitism. You know, recent polls have shown that large numbers of Europeans believe that their Jewish citizens are not loyal to their country, and that they have a disproportionate amount of political and economic power. You know, right here in the United States, we've seen an unbelievable increase in hate crimes against Jewish citizens. Anti-Semitism is history's oldest hatred. This hostility and prejudice toward Jewish people. The Nazi Holocaust is history's most extreme example of anti-Semitism. You know, as we wind this podcast down, you may be saying to yourself, well, In today's world, I'm not part of these attitudes. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions. Have you ever heard a friend say or someone say that they were Jewed down? That they were Jewed down about something? Or have you ever heard someone refer to a greedy Jewish businessman or a landlord? Or have you ever heard of someone being advised not to live in a particular neighborhood because most of the residents there are Jewish? I want to suggest to you that if you tolerate these kinds of stereotypes and jokes, then you're contributing to contemporary anti-Semitism, hatred of the Jews. And I'll just end with what you already know. Jesus calls on us to love our neighbors as ourselves and to love them as he loved us. That's the command of the Messiah. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast today, and I want to ask you during this fragile time, pray for the nation of Israel and the victims of this current conflict. God bless you. Thank you.